Today is the first video in the 6th year of Briefcase, and it all began on the 27th of May 2018 when I launched a case from Brazil, and I then got told how badly I'd pronounced the name of the person. Sometimes I was told in a quite eloquent manner, but other times less so. That was my welcome to the world of being a YouTube creator. I'd like to thank all of you for supporting the channel through these 5 years. I know some of you have been here since the very beginning, but whenever you saw the first Briefcase video, thank you for taking the time to visit the channel, and thank you for all your feedback and comments. I really do appreciate it. There are 2 questions that I'm constantly asked. One is who was Jack the Ripper, and the other is what are my personal favourite videos. Unfortunately, I'm unable to answer either question. But today, I thought I would share with you 3 of the videos that for one particular reason or another always stand out in my mind. The first video was launched in October 2019, and the reason that this is one of my favourites is that when researching the case, I knew every street mentioned and remember thinking, I've been to all of those places. It's also a pretty strange story. Henry Wainwright was born in the East End of London on the 12th of July, 1838. His father was an entrepreneurial man who during the first half of the 19th century built up a successful brush-making factory. This enabled him to give his family a comfortable life, and he made sure that his sons Henry and Thomas were well educated. When Henry finished his education, he joined his father in the business, and when his father died, Henry inherited it. The factory was located at 215 Whitechapel Road, in the heart of the East End of London. It was an area with many factories, but for the people who lived there, it was a poor, overcrowded area, and many people lived in cramped conditions, without sanitation or proper ventilation. Whitechapel was filled with pubs and lodging houses, which provided shelter for over 8,000 homeless and destitute people per night. Henry, however, didn't have to worry about the poor social conditions around his factory, as he lived with his wife and 4 children in the upmarket Tredegar Square. Henry was well known in the area and seemed to be a popular member of the community. Most people considered him to be a highly respectable, hard-working businessman. He was determined to grow his business and build on his father's legacy, so he would go to the factory every day to make sure all the orders went out on time and that everything was running smoothly. The business grew and had many large and important customers. The factory was very close to the Pavilion Theatre, and Henry would often go there and talk to the actresses. He would spend a lot of time speaking to the young women, who he thought would be impressed by the fact that he owned a factory and was considered to be a wealthy and well-regarded member of the community. In 1871, Henry met a young lady named Harriet Lane. She was an attractive 20-year-old who had worked as a milliner's apprentice. She was young and lively, and he had become very much infatuated by her. The infatuation continued, and Henry wanted his young mistress to live closer to the factory, so he found an apartment for her at 70 St. Peter Street. Harriet started to call herself Mrs. Percy King, and she would walk around the area, safe in the knowledge that she did not need to work, as all her accounts would be settled by Henry, who also paid her rent and gave her a generous allowance of £5 a week. Henry juggled his time between the factory, his home, and the apartment he rented for Harriet, and over the next 2 years, Harriet gave birth to 2 children. Now, with his extended family to provide for, Henry's double life was starting to be somewhat problematic. Harriet had become very demanding and asked Henry for more money. She didn't like to be the mistress of a well-respected business owner and pressured him to leave his wife and be with her. He was spending so much time trying to keep his complicated personal situation under control, but it diverted focus from his brush factory. In 1873 there was a worldwide financial crisis, which led to a depression in Europe and North America. The industrial nations such as Britain were hit hard by the sharp economic decline, and Henry had been slow to react to the downturn. In 1874, He moved his secret family to less expensive accommodation in Sydney Square, but this did little to help his situation. Harriet started to drink, and when she drank, she became very indiscreet and would talk to anyone who would listen to her about her circumstances. Henry became very anxious. His business was failing, his debts were mounting, and Harriet was becoming increasingly more demanding. He needed a plan. Henry asked his brother Thomas if he would help him. His plan, however, was a relatively strange one. He requested that his brother write to Harriet, using the pseudonym Edward Frake. These letters would let Harriet know that the imaginary Edward admired her and would very much like to make her acquaintance. Thomas agreed and started writing to Harriet. Being a single mother of 2 in Victorian Britain, Harriet was not accustomed to receiving correspondence from eligible men and was very pleased to learn that she had Namara, and very soon the imaginary Edward and Harriet started to regularly exchange letters. Eventually the pair agreed to meet, so on Friday the 11th of September 1874, Harriet put on her best dress, which was grey with black buttons, a bonnet and a cape, and after leaving her children in the care of a friend and neighbour named Mrs. Wilmore, she set off to meet the mysterious Edward Frake. Harriet did not return. Later that day, men who were working outside Henry Wainwright's factory at 215 Whitechapel Road thought they heard 3 gunshots. They told the constable and the area was searched, but nothing suspicious was found. The area was very busy and very noisy, and the constable told the men that noises are often mistaken for gunfire. A few days later, Henry went to see Mrs. Wilmore, as he had allegedly received a letter from Harriet. It stated that Harriet and Mr. Frake were getting married, and that Mrs. Wilmore must look after the children. Henry assured her that he would pay her to care for them, but as Henry's business continued to fail, the payments became infrequent. A month later, Mrs. Wilmore received a telegram from Mr. Frake, informing her that he was taking Harriet on a little holiday to Paris. Mrs. Wilmore was worried about the situation. Her friend would not have just abandoned her children and disappear. Harriet's parents were also very concerned, as it was totally out of character for their daughter to stop all communication with them. Harriet's parents went to see Henry to inquire about their daughter, but he told them that the last time he saw Harriet was when she asked him for some money, which he gave her, and she said that she was going to spend some time in the coastal town of Brighton. As the months passed, there was no more communication from Harriet. The economy was still in recession, and Henry tried to rescue his failing business. Mrs. Wilmore looked after the children, and life continued in the East End of London. Henry's financial issues didn't improve, and eventually he was declared bankrupt. This meant he was only left with one option, and that was to sell the Whitechapel factory. However, the factory housed a dark secret, and one that Henry would have to deal with before any sale could be completed. So strangely, on the 11th of September 1875, exactly 1 year since Harriet had gone missing, Henry went into his factory armed with a shovel. He removed some floorboards and then started to dig. It did not take long for him to unearth a body. The body was wrapped in cloth and in a state of decomposure. The smell was terrible, but Henry was determined to move it, and any evidence that a crime had been committed at 215 Whitechapel Road. The body was heavy and too big for him to carry on his own. He decided that the best way to transport it would be in bags, and he proceeded with the grisly task of dismembering the decomposing body. Henry then carefully wrapped the pieces and put them in 2 bags before considering what to do next. He could not transport both bags at the same time, as they were just too heavy, but he did not want to take one bag and leave the other, as there was a chance that it may get discovered, especially as the smell was so overpowering, and someone was bound to investigate where it was coming from. Henry sent a message to a trusted ex-employee named Alfred Stokes to come and help him carry the bags. Alfred duly arrived and was immediately confronted by a terrible smell. Henry instructed him to pick up a bag and take it down to the road so he could hail a cab. When they reached the corner of the street, Henry put his bag down and wandered up the road to get the cab. However, the curious Alfred decided to look at exactly what he had been helping to remove from the factory and peered into the bag that he had been carrying. He carefully removed some of the cloth and could scarcely believe what he had uncovered, as in front of him was a human head and a human hand. He quickly recovered the package and closed the bag, and when Henry returned with the cab, he assisted him in loading his grim cargo and watched as the cab slowly made its way up the Whitechapel road. Alfred did not know what to do next, so decided to follow the cab as far as he could. Luckily, the cab was a growler type that was pulled by one horse and was slow to travel from street to street. Alfred stopped a constable and told him what he had witnessed, but the constable did not believe him and told him to move on. Remarkably, Henry instructed the cab to stop as he collected a passenger, his latest girlfriend, a young, pretty dancer from the Pavilion Theatre named Alice Day. So as his ex-mistress's dismembered body was in the back of the cab, his new one sat up front next to him. Alfred continued his pursuit of the cab, passing through Aldgate and Leadenhall Street to the Hop Exchange. He then saw two more constables and told them about the body in the bag. This time the constables decided to act and follow the cab. The cab eventually stopped at 56 Borough High Street, which was a building leased by Henry's younger brother Thomas. The officers approached Henry and asked to see what was in the bags and what was responsible for such a foul smell. Henry was very reluctant to open the bags and offered to bribe the policeman, but the constables were not interested, and after opening the bags, they arrested Henry and his girlfriend Alice and took them to the police station. The police soon tracked down his brother Thomas, who had leased the building where Henry was arrested, and interviewed the two men separately. The body parts were taken to St Saviour's mortuary and were examined by a pathologist. He found 3 bullets in the skull and told the police that the deceased was a female between 20 to 25 years old and who had had children. He also noted a distinctive scar below the right knee. Hair samples and clothes were all preserved for evidence. The police also conducted a search of 215 Whitechapel Road and found the shallow grave under the floorboards. They found a pair of metal earrings and 2 gold rings, along with a pocket knife, and inside the factory they also discovered a small 6-shooter revolver. Alfred Stokes informed the police that he feared the body may have been that of Harriet Lane. The police then investigated her disappearance, which led them to the house of her friend and neighbour, Mrs. Wilmore. Mrs. Wilmore then gave them the address of Harriet's parents, and they all came to the police station, where they were shown the clothing found on the body, and Mrs. Wilmore said it matched what Harriet had been wearing when she last saw her on the 11th of September 1874. Harriet's parents identified the scar on the leg as identical to a scar their daughter had. They also confirmed that the jewellery found at Henry's factory had belonged to Harriet. The police considered that they had enough evidence to charge both Henry and his brother, Thomas, with the murder of Harriet Lane, but decided that they had no evidence to suggest that Alice Day was involved, so they released her. In November 1875, the trial of Henry and Thomas Wainwright began. The first witness called was Alfred Stokes, who told the court how he discovered the body in the bags and how he had followed the cab. He also said that Henry had told him that he had a shovel and a hammer that needed to be taken from the factory and discreetly sold. Henry's financial difficulties were highlighted in the court by the prosecution. They outlined his double life and how the recession had made a big impact on his personal life, making it very difficult to maintain a second secret family. But the defence tried to turn this to their advantage by saying that the defendant had met a man in a pub who asked him to transport the bags to 56 Borough High Street and since he found himself in very poor financial circumstances, he thought that it would be an easy way to make some money. They added that the defendant was not aware of what he was being asked to move. The defence also questioned whether the body was actually that of Harriet Lane. On Wednesday the 1st of December 1875, the trial ended and the jury deliberated the case before returning to court to deliver their verdict. Henry Wainwright was found guilty of murder and the judge sentenced him to death. His brother Thomas Wainwright was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact and the judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison. The judge also ordered that Alfred Stokes be rewarded with the sum of £30. On the 21st of December 1875, on a cold winter's morning, Henry Wainwright was taken from his cell as a large crowd gathered outside Newgate Prison. And even though public executions had ceased 7 years earlier, his crime was so notorious throughout the East End of London that the locals wanted to be sure that the sentence was carried out. There was a loud cheer from the crowd when the black flag was raised, signalling that justice had been done. The second video was released in April 2021, and I hope that you'll all hear an improvement in the narration. The case had been requested quite a bit, and after it launched, I received a few emails from people informing me that they're related to the person who committed the crime. It's also a case from the early 1830s, and as all of you probably know, these are the cases that I prefer. Frances Stewart was born in 1813. She was a very happy child, and everyone knew her as Frankie. When she was very young, her parents, named Isaiah and Barbara, moved to Burke County in North Carolina. Burke County was named after Thomas Burke, who at the time had been serving as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Later, he was elected to governor of North Carolina. It was an area of just over 500 square miles, and when Mr. and Mrs. Stewart moved there in around 1820, the population had grown to 13,500 people. The Stewarts lived near the small village of Kona, and not far from a family of a gentleman named Jacob Silver. Jacob's wife, Elizabeth, had died while giving birth to their son Charlie, who was born on the 3rd of October 1812. He was a year older than Frankie. Jacob had since remarried, and by 1830, his wife had given birth to 4 more children. The Silvers were a more affluent family in the area. Although not rich, they owned quite a lot of land and were considered wealthier than most. This was in contrast to the Stewarts, who were a family of modest means. Charlie was a popular person and seemed to be liked by everyone in the local community. He was tall and strong and was known to be very good at playing the fife. This was a small wooden instrument, similar to a piccolo. Frankie grew up to be a very beautiful young lady. She was kind and helpful, and it was no surprise when the announcement was made that Charlie Silver and Frankie Stewart were to be married. They moved to a small cabin not far from where they had both been brought up, and it appeared that they were a well-suited, happy couple. Charlie would work to provide for his wife, and Frankie would look after their home. On the 3rd of November 1830, she gave birth to a baby daughter, who they named Nancy. Although things may have looked idyllic from the outside, the couple's relationship was not as good as it was perceived to have been. Charlie liked to drink, and this angered Frankie. Their house was small, and it was not easy looking after a young baby. The couple would often argue, which often resulted in Charlie hitting his wife. Although they had a house, which was on land given to Charlie by his father, life was not easy. In 1828, gold had been discovered in Burke County. Many people came in search of their fortune. 2 years later, in the summer of 1830, the county suffered a terrible drought. Charlie may have believed that while he was out working, hunting, or occasionally drinking, his wife should be at home looking after their house and the baby. But by 1830, the attitude towards women had started to change. As industrialisation began, a lot more women started to work in factories and many female organisations were formed. In 1821, Emma Willard founded the Troy Female Seminary in the city of Troy in New York. This was the first American educational institution to offer young women a pre-college education equal to that given to young men. Although Frankie would have accepted that she had obligations and duties in the home, she would probably also have been aware of the changes that were happening across the country and of the brave ladies who championed women's rights and social reform. As Christmas 1831 approached, the weather was cold. It had been a particularly cold December with much snow and ice. When the weather was like this, Frankie would spend most of her time in the house. Christmas Day was a Sunday this year. Everyone would put on their best clothes, go to church, and enjoy the festivities. It was a day that Frankie was very much looking forward to. On December the 23rd, Frankie went to the home of her husband's parents. She was worried, as Charlie had not come home. She explained that he had gone hunting with a neighbour named George Young, but still had not returned. She wondered if maybe Charlie's parents had seen him, but they had not. The following day, December the 24th, Charlie was still not home. Frankie was now getting more anxious. Again, she went to Charlie's parents' house and told his father Jacob that his son had still not come home. By now, Jacob was also becoming concerned. It was cold, and Charlie would surely not have camped out all night. Jacob and Frankie went to see if George Young had returned. They knocked on his door, but strangely, George was in the house. He told them that he had not gone hunting with Charlie and had not seen him for some time. Frankie seemed particularly agitated. She told George that she did not believe him. Her husband was missing and she needed to find him. Jacob told her to calm herself. He said goodbye to George Young and then accompanied his daughter-in-law back to her house. It was not too far. As they walked along the narrow path, Jacob wondered where his son might be. When they arrived, they were greeted by Charlie's dog. Jacob thought that he must have returned. He certainly would not have gone hunting without his beloved dog. However, Charlie had not returned, and after a brief look around, Jacob noticed that there were no footprints leading from the house to the woods. There was light snow on the ground, so surely there should have been some. He continued to search, but he soon realised that Charlie was nowhere to be seen. Christmas came and went, then New Year, and there was still no sign of Charlie. What had happened to him was a mystery, but some of the people who lived in the rural community around Kona were starting to get suspicious. They would speculate about what could have happened to him. It was known that Frankie and Charlie would often argue, but they had a daughter, and Frankie was a petite young lady, barely 18 years of age, while Charlie was a strong 6-foot man. Surely she could not have harmed him. One man that thought that Frankie may have known more about Charlie's disappearance than she was letting on was a wise elderly gentleman named Jack Collis. He decided to go to the small house where Frankie and Charlie lived and see for himself if there was any evidence that something untoward may have happened. He waited until Frankie had gone into the village before walking down the path and into her yard. Something, however, did not seem right. He entered the house. It was a wooden cabin-type building with only a few rooms. He looked around. There was a strange smell, and in the fireplace, he could see small pieces of bone. He also noticed that the ashes were greasy, and there were bloodstains on the floorboards. It looked like something bad may have happened in the remote cabin that Frankie and Charlie had shared. Mr. Collis decided to inform the sheriff. The sheriff soon arrived, and a full search of the property and the surrounding area took place. They searched the woods and the river, but when they started to look in the area closer to the house, they made the grisly discovery of a head and a torso. The mystery that had been consuming the people who lived around Kona had been solved. Charlie Silver was dead. It was now the 9th of January 1832, and Frankie was arrested, along with her mother Barbara and her brother named Blackston. They were all taken to the county jail in the town of Morganton. Isaiah Stewart would tell anyone who would listen that his family were innocent of the charges. and managed to obtain a writ of habeas corpus, which stated that his family were being detained illegally. On the 17th of January, just a week after being arrested, Barbara and Blackstone were released, while Frankie remained locked up. She was questioned about what had happened, but she did not say anything. She just told the sheriff that she was innocent. The news of the murder of Charlie Silver and the arrest of his wife Frankie soon spread throughout Burke County, and rumours surfaced as to what actually happened on the 22nd of December, 1831. Some speculated that Frankie attacked him with an axe when he returned home drunk. Others said that she hit him while he was asleep by the fire after many hours of chopping wood. Rumours also persisted that Frankie's family were involved, as the Stuarts wanted to move and had tried to convince Charlie to sell the land and go with them. But Charlie had told them that he was not going to leave. Despite all the speculation, the charges against Barbara and Blackstone Stewart were eventually dropped, and on the 17th of March 1832, Frankie Silver was charged with murder. The trial of Frankie Silver started on Thursday the 29th of March 1832, and she pleaded not guilty. No one had seen her commit the crime, so any evidence presented by the prosecution could only be considered as circumstantial. The prosecution, however, were determined to prove that Charlie Silver had been murdered by his wife, and his body had been dismembered and burned before being buried in an attempt to hide the evidence. Frankie was not allowed to testify in her own defence. Instead, it was up to her attorney, Thomas Wilson, to argue her case. When all the evidence was presented, the jury retired to consider their verdict. However, they were unable to agree. There were whispers around the courtroom that they were in favour of an acquittal, but the judge requested that some witnesses be recalled so they could hear the evidence again. Strangely, these witnesses were permitted to discuss the case and hear each other's testimony, which may have influenced what they had said at the second time of questioning. When the jury was sent out to deliberate again, they did not take long to return with a unanimous verdict. They found the defendant, Frankie Silver, guilty, and the judge sentenced her to death. The sentence was appealed, and public sentiment started to go very much in favour of sparing the life of young Frankie Silver. A petition was raised, which was signed by many of the residents of Burke County, including members of the jury who had convicted her. Before the appeal was considered by the governor, Frankie's father managed to break her out of jail. How he did this is unclear, but as she had received so much local support, a sympathetic jailer may have just let him enter her cell and free her. She cut her hair short and disguised herself as a boy. It took over a week for the sheriff to apprehend her again. He eventually found her walking behind her father's wagon on the road out of North Carolina, going into Tennessee. The news of her escape had fascinated the people of Burke County, and more supporters came forward, demanding that Governor Swain overturn her sentence. Even the more affluent ladies of Morganton wrote to him requesting that he release the young 18-year-old mother. Governor Swain, however, rejected these pleas, and Frankie Silver's execution was set for Friday the 12th of July 1833. It is not known why he rejected the overwhelming public sentiment for a reprieve. Some say it was because he had previously been regarded to be a lenient High Court judge and now wanted to show that he was a governor capable of making the correct decisions, however unpopular they may be. Others think that his decision may have been influenced by the Silver family, who owned much land in the area. Just before her execution, it is reported that Frankie confessed to the murder. She said that Charlie Silver treated her very badly and was abusive towards her. She told of how he was cruel and failed to support either her or their daughter. She claimed that her husband was loading his gun and had threatened to shoot her, so she just picked up the nearest thing available, which was an axe, and struck him. She added that immediately afterwards, she regretted what she had done. If her attorney had used this as a defence in her original trial, she would probably have been freed, as her actions could have been considered as self-defence. Francis Stuart Silver was hanged in Morganton on July the 12th, 1833. What exactly happened that night inside the small cabin remains a mystery. Many people still believe that she did not act alone, but whether she did, or whether she had the assistance of her family, is something that Frankie took to her grave. It is said that as she was about to be hanged, she was asked if she had anything to say, and her father shouted, "Die with it in you, Frankie." Although young Frankie died on the 12th of July, her legend lives on. There have been books, plays, and songs written about her. Charlie and Frankie's daughter Nancy was only 2 years old when her mother was hanged. She was raised by her grandparents and married in January 1850 when she was aged 19. She went on to have 4 children with her husband named David William Parker, who tragically died in 1865. She married again in 1870 and had 1 more child, but this marriage failed and she reverted to using her first husband's surname. Nancy died in Macron County, North Carolina, on the 20th of September 1901, aged 70. This third case is the one that I wanted to launch the channel with. Unfortunately, I just did not have enough information at the time. I eventually managed to put the video together in May 2022. So sit back as we go to mid-19th century France. In the middle of the 19th century, the French economy was still largely dominated by the agricultural sector. However, in the mid-1840s, there was a poor harvest, which affected many crops including potatoes, wheat, barley and corn. This led to an increase in food prices, and the cost of a loaf of bread doubled. Industry was not as developed as in some other European countries, as banking and credit facilities did not meet the needs of the changing economy. Most of the people still preferred to invest in gold or land, rather than put their trust in the banks. As unemployment rose and the economy fell into an economic depression, the government were accused of corruption. There was also discord amongst the French people. In the morning of the 15th of April 1847, in the beautiful city of Toulouse, in southwest France, a bookbinder named Bertrand Conté was preparing to take 2 baskets of books that he had been repairing for the Institute of the Christian Brethren. He had been working from his small workshop binding books for many years, and the quality of his work was known throughout the area. The Institute occupied a very big building in the city. It had a large courtyard, a garden, and a chapel. On the other side of the road, there was a sleeping accommodation and a school where new recruits would study the Bible and learn about their faith. This area was joined to the main institute by a tunnel under the road. On this particular morning, it was raining. The rain had started in the early hours and had not stopped. It was also quite windy. The baskets of books were carried by 2 of his female assistants. One was named Marion Roumenac. She had been working for Monsieur Conté for some time. The other was an apprentice, who after a year was now in her final week of service. She was 14 years old, and her name was Cécile Combet. Cécile was from a very poor family, who lived in a very notorious part of the city. She had received very little education, but when she was younger, she had often run errands for the local nuns, and they had seemed very fond of her and taught her to read and write. As the 3 of them approached the institute, the porter opened the door. The baskets were then placed on the table, and Monsieur Conté instructed that Madame Marion Roumenac return to the workshop to continue her duties. He then passed Cécile his umbrella and asked her to wait until he returned. He then went with the porter to the library to deliver the books. He often visited the institute and soon became distracted. He began to speak to the director, not only about other books that may need binding, but also about the situation and the uneasiness that seemed to be spreading throughout the country. Although he had told Cécile that he would only be a short while, he did not in fact return until 45 minutes later, by which time Cécile was nowhere to be seen. The umbrella, however, had been left leaning against the wall. He asked the porter if he had seen her, but he replied that he had not. There had been quite a few visitors already, and he had been busy opening and closing the door, but he had not seen her leave. So if she was not there, she must have left from the other entrance. Monsieur Conté was not overly concerned. He was aware that Cécile's mother had not been well, so presumed that she must have gone home to see if she needed anything. He did not look for her, as he was anxious to prepare for his journey to the city of Auch, some 80 kilometres away, where he had some important business to attend to. He left later that afternoon. Meanwhile, Cécile's family were getting worried. as no one had seen her since she had left for work that morning. They asked at the workshop, but they were told that she had not returned from the institute. As evening came, there was still no sign of her. They searched the streets and asked anyone who passed by if they had seen her, but no one could remember seeing her at all that day. They asked people to help in the search, but it seemed that apart from the family, no one was particularly bothered that poor Mademoiselle Cécile Combet, the 14-year-old bookbinder's apprentice, was missing. The following day, Friday the 16th of April, the gravedigger arrived at the cemetery at Saint-Aubin. It was early, just 6 a.m, and it looked as though it would be a pleasant day. The rain and the winds had passed, and the sun was already shining. As he unlocked the padlock from the gate, he noticed something strange. At one end of the cemetery, near a large wall, it looked like a young woman kneeling in prayer. As he went closer, he saw that she was actually lying on her face and knees, and she was being supported by her elbows. He reached out and touched her, but there was no reaction. He touched her again. She was stiff and cold. The gravedigger then realised that she was dead. The authorities were contacted and an investigation immediately began, led by Commissioner Lemel. As news spread that a body of a young woman had been found in the cemetery at Saint-Aubin, people remembered that the previous day, the family of Cécile Combet were worried, as they had not seen her since the early morning. The commissioner ordered that someone who had known Cécile come to identify if her deceased was indeed her. Soon after, it was confirmed that the body in the cemetery was that of 14-year-old Cécile Combet. Commissioner Lemel was puzzled by the position of the body. It lay in the corner between two cemetery walls. One wall separated the cemetery from the Rue Riquet, and the other from the garden of the Institute of the Christian Brethren. So how did it get there, and who could have placed it there? Different theories were discussed. Could the body have been brought at night and deliberately placed in the position where it was found? This would have been difficult, as the cemetery gate was always locked at night, and no footprints had been found near the body. It had rained very hard the previous day, and the ground was still wet, so there would have been footprints in the soft earth between the gate and the place where the body was found. The second theory discussed by the investigators was that the body may have been thrown over the wall, either from the Garden of the Brethren or from Rue Riquet. The plants on the wall, which connected the cemetery to the Garden of the Brethren, looked as if they had not been disturbed, so that only left the possibility that someone had thrown the body from the side of the Rue Riquet, but nothing seemed out of place on that side either. A post-mortem was carried out. The pathologist established that the deceased had been assaulted and then hit with a heavy object. He also ascertained that she died at around 10 o'clock on the previous morning. The material found on the poor girl's body and clothes was investigated. There was a geranium plant in her hair, a flower that grew in abundance in the garden of the Institute of the Christian Brethren. There were also leaves from a cypress tree and shreds of what appeared to be fibres from a rope that very much looked identical to the rope that could be found in the Brethren's garden. At first, it looked like the cemetery may have been accessed from the garden and the body placed there, but the cypress trees only grew between the cemetery wall and the Rue Riquet, and the geranium petal could have easily blown in the wind. The investigators did manage to find a geranium in full bloom, with a petal missing, in the Brethren's garden near to the cemetery wall, but this was not proof enough to say that the person who was responsible for this terrible crime had entered the cemetery from the garden. However, it was then confirmed that although the cemetery was locked every night, there were occasions when the padlock to the gate had been left unlocked. If it had been left unlocked that night, someone could have entered from there and then closed the padlock when they left. It was also pointed out that although there were no footprints in the earth that surrounded the body, there were also no indentations in the grass where the knees and elbows of the deceased had been placed. Commissioner Lemel thought that the most credible explanation was that Cécile had been placed there and that the person who had committed this terrible crime had carried the body through the gates. But not everyone agreed with this. He now had to find out who was actually responsible. Cécile was last seen in the Institute, holding Monsieur Bertrand Conte's umbrella. This caused the commissioner to think that the crime had been committed by someone who had been inside the Institute of the Christian Brethren on the morning of the 15th of April. The funeral of Cécile Combet took place 5 days later, on the 20th of April 1847. She was laid to rest in the Tech Abad Cemetery and her funeral was paid by money donated by the people of the city. The commissioner was reminded that the bookbinder, Monsieur Bertrand Conte, had some years earlier been the subject of much gossip regarding his improper behaviour towards his brother's wife. Monsieur Conte had also shown very little concern when it was discovered that Cécile had gone missing. Commissioner Lemerle ordered that he be arrested. Of course, Monsieur Bertrand Conte denied that he had anything to do with the terrible events of the 15th of April. He told the commissioner that he had left Cécile with his umbrella in the hallway and had asked her to wait for him. He suggested that as he took rather longer than he had thought, she must have just left the institute and met the person who committed this terrible crime while alone in the streets. The next day, however, he asked to see the magistrate and told him that he now remembered that when he had left Cécile in the hallway, two of the brothers were deep in conversation, Brother Dubrien and Brother Leotade. He presumed that they had been there to keep out of the rain. Commissioner Lemerle ordered that this should be investigated, and they were both interviewed, but neither could remember being in the hallway that morning, and no one could remember seeing them there. None of the other brothers were able to corroborate Monsieur Conte's story. The porter had not recalled seeing them. Neither had Madame Marion Rumenac. Nevertheless, they were arrested and interrogated. After much consideration, Commissioner Lemerle concluded that the crime had been committed by Brother Leotade. His real name was Louis Bonnefou, and he had entered the institute 9 years earlier in 1838. His main duty was as a linen worker for the school, but he had also been given some other bursary duties. It was believed that he had lingered in the hallway before luring Cécile away, telling her that he was going to feed the rabbits and the pigeons in the barn. He then assaulted and murdered her and hid her body before returning at night, when he took the ladder and threw the body over the wall. Brother Leotade, or Louis Bonnefou, was put in prison to await his trial, during which time he was beaten on many occasions. As the prosecution was building the case against him, witnesses for the defence were arrested and placed in a cell for a minimum of 1 night. Monsieur Bertrand Conte, whose accusations had placed Brother Leotade in this position, was also put in a cell and was made to stay there for 4 months, as was Brother Dubrien. Both men were eventually released. The trial of Brother Leotade did not commence until February 1848, and ever since his arrest, he had been kept in a dark cell in the Toulouse prison. The prosecution offered a very weak case against him. It was only Monsieur Conte who could place the defendant in the hallway, in view of young Cécile Combet. During the trial, the French Revolution of 1848 began, which ended the rule of the monarchy and established the French Second Republic, led by Napoleon Bonaparte. Due to this, the trial had to be adjourned, and a second trial began a few weeks later. The prosecution told the courts that the material on the body indicated that the deceased had been murdered within the grounds of the institute. Although no footprints had been found near the body, there had been some discovered near the flower beds and a geranium petal in Cécile's hair. There was also straw and a pigeon feather, which must have come from the barn. They believed that after murdering her, Brother Leotade had returned to the barn, placed a ladder against the wall, and then thrown the body into the cemetery. This was challenged by the defence, and even though the prosecution could not produce any witnesses who could in any way put some type of credibility to this assumption, the defence was unable to produce any witnesses who could disprove it. Strangely, Brother Leotade had changed the room in which he slept just 2 nights after the murder. The prosecution claimed that this had been arranged by the director of the institute in order that the new room would have no access to the garden or the barn, so it would seem as though he could not have committed the crime. It was decided that the court should visit the institute to see exactly how these events may have unfolded. During the visit, the brothers of the Christian Brethren behaved in a somewhat awkward manner. They attempted to ignore the court's visits, and when questioned, gave incorrect and misleading answers. The director of the Brethren said that it was impossible that the crime had occurred within the grounds of the institute. He was supported by the Archbishop of Toulouse and the Bishop of Mont-de-Marsan. There was much anti-religious sentiment in France at the time, and this, coupled with the fact that the brothers in the institute had not been very forthcoming in their cooperation with the authorities over the investigation, it made it easy for the prosecution to get both the newspapers and the public believing that Brother Leotade was indeed guilty. When the trial eventually finished, the evidence was deliberated for some time before the verdict of guilty was delivered, but guilty with extenuating circumstances. Brother Leotade, or Louis Bonnefou, the name in which he was tried under, was sentenced to life in prison. He had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, and this continued while he was in his cell in the Toulouse prison. The conditions there were very bad, and 2 years later he became quite ill. He sent for the prison chaplain and the prison warden. It seemed that Louis was aware that he was dying. He told them that he did not even know who the girl found in the cemetery was until he was arrested for her murder, a murder that he did not commit, and that he was innocent of all the charges for which he had been found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He told the chaplain that he would meet God with a clear conscience. The following day, Louis Bonnefou died. The people of Toulouse would often speak about the case. Some wondered if an innocent man had been convicted. Then, on the 10th of January 1866, the headless body of a woman, wrapped in her petticoats, was found at a lock near the Menin Bridge. She was identified to be Marie Guillaume, a woman known to the police for her loose morals. She had been living with a man named Jean-Joseph Aspect, who was an innkeeper. He was known to be aggressive, and on many occasions, people had seen him arguing with Marie. As police started to investigate the crime, witnesses told her they had seen him pulling a heavy trunk. Investigators went to his inn. They found evidence that a crime had been committed. There were bloodstains on the floor in his room. There were also Marie's belongings. He was arrested and charged with her murder. Before he had become an innkeeper, Jean-Joseph Aspect had been a cook in the Institute of the Christian Brethren, and while awaiting his trial, he allegedly confessed to the Bishop of Miglo to the killing 19 years earlier of Cécile Combet. He apparently said that he had lured the young girl into the kitchen and after murdering her, hid her body under the oven. He then returned that night, carried her through the tunnel to the garden, where he climbed a ladder and threw the body into the cemetery. However, Jean-Joseph Aspect refused to speak again about the case. He was instead tried for the murder of Marie Guillaume, found guilty and sentenced to life in prison at the penal colony of Cayenne. He never publicly admitted his involvement in the crime committed on the 15th of April 1847. To this day, Brother Leotade, or Jean-Louis Bonnefou, is the person who is documented as being responsible for the murder of Cécile Combet. Once again, thank you all so much for your support. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and Briefcase will be back next week with a case from a country never before visited on the channel.